One of the difficulties in introducing a speaker, especially a speaker such as Professor Ross Terrell, is that you try to avoid simply giving a dry recitation of all of his credentials and books that he's written and articles and other things. And yet, on the other hand, people who come out to hear him speak have a right to know something about who they're listening to. And so I decided that since I was going to introduce him, I'd try and avoid that, and then I was handed a 3-page list of things I mentioned. And so I thought I'd just briefly go down and list some of the things that you might want to know about him. Professor Terrell is an associate professor of government at Harvard University. And he's written a whole lot of books, and he's edited some other books too. He's got 3 books that he's written and 3 books that he's edited and contributed to in this way, and most of them are about China, so we'll go to that. And he's published a lot of articles in academic journals, and we all know about that. And he's also published articles in general journals, and I take that to mean magazines. That's where I come in. And things like Atlantic Monthly and New Republic and a lot of other things. And there's just a lot. And if I start listing them and reading them, it would get as interesting and fascinating as the subjects are and everything. It would just be a really long list, the whole page. And I've mentioned he's held a number of very distinguished appointments. And I think I'll just mention that he's an associate professor of government at Harvard University rather than reading down a list. And he also is a graduate of Harvard University and received his PhD degree there. I was really impressed when I saw all of these things, and but one might think that well, maybe this gives you the picture that we have an ivory tower intellectual who writes a lot of books but hasn't really done a lot, and to me that would mean wouldn't really know much. But I found that that's not true at all, and that Professor Terrell has visited China a number of times over a really long period of time. We've spoken to people who've been to China. He's been to China on 4 different occasions as early as 1964, and his most recent visit was in 1975. I imagine that he has seen children put on cultural performances in daycare centers in Peking, as all of the people who've gone to China from Ames have, but he's done some other things there too. He's had an opportunity to meet with top Chinese leaders, including the late Zhou Enlai. He recently has been asked to testify, it was just this week, wasn't it? Before Congress regarding normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China and the United States, and has the United States relations with Taiwan, which is involved in that. Tonight he'll be speaking on U.S.-China relations in perspective, and when he tells me that when he finishes his address, he welcomes any questions and comments that anybody may have, and looks forward to a lively discussion. In addition to that, we have copies which are available of several of his books, which he would be happy to autograph. So without taking any more time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Ross Terrell.
Thank you, David, and let me say that I'm very happy to be here in Ames tonight, and I think this topic is an important one for all of us. I'll try to throw some light on it, and I welcome some discussion after I've made an analysis of the subject as I see it. It might be useful to go back a bit into history and look at the encounter of these two countries, and I would say there are some key mental starting points on the two sides. On the American side, 3 starting points in approaching China. One was that for the Americans in the 19th century, there was the assumption that America was innocent of the stains of colonialism that the Europeans had upon them in their venture into Asia. There was a sense of innocence, that America was a democratic nation by its birth. And in Asia, America stood for certain values that no other Western power could stand for. Not the British, not the French, not the Dutch, and so on. Then there was a sense of mission about the American presence on the China coast. That Christianity and democracy and the rule of law, these were ideas that America could and should take to the Asian people. And a good part of America's early knowledge of China and early impression of China was in fact formed through missionary activity. The direction of expectation in the American mind was a one-way direction. That's to say, it was thought that we Westerners had something to bring. We didn't, speaking of we in the sense of the Western presence, we didn't think that China had anything to contribute other than to receive what we were bringing. That's what was meant by a sense of mission. And then I think a third mental starting point on the American side is a kind of Prometheanism, the feeling that things could be reshaped out there by an American presence. There was a senator from this part of the country, not quite this part, but a little bit to the south, who remarked, Senator Wherry, who remarked that America will lift Shanghai up, ever up, until, God willing, it's just like Kansas City. And that expresses the sense of mission and the Prometheanism, and maybe a touch of innocence as well. And then, in a different vein, General Wheeler said that the Far East has become our Far West. Now, the point about these 3 mental starting points is that they have all been somewhat shattered by the Vietnam War. I think it's fair to say that Americans of all points of view don't feel the same sense of innocence about American foreign policy in East Asia after Vietnam. Was it really very different, after all, from the French? Where was the special character to the American performance that distinguished it from what the Europeans had done? The sense of mission also. It's simply a fact that the American people are not as interested in supporting the projection of American military power far from US borders as they were before Vietnam. At the height of that war, there were about 1 million American troops under arms, stationed in an arc around the doorstep of China, from Japan to Thailand and on the islands and nations in between. There's about a quarter of that number today. The sense of mission has sagged a bit, and the Promethean spirit too. We're not quite as sure as we used to that the Marines can remake the world by landing wherever. The dollar is not quite as powerful internationally as it was 15 years ago. And indeed, after certain convulsions here, summed up maybe by Watergate, we are not quite sure that our way of doing politics is necessarily the only way and the way that has to be introduced to other peoples. Now, I mentioned these three starting points in America's historical approach to China because the fact that they have been superseded by events is a big reason why America and the People's Republic of China are now starting to deal with each other in a business-like way. That's to say, if these three starting points had not been superseded, the opening to China in 1972, led by Nixon and Kissinger, would not have taken place. That leads me to what are the starting points on the Chinese side for this relationship. I would say there are four starting points, and in the Chinese case, I think that they are more continuous, past and still today. And when I say the Chinese case, I mean the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership of the PRC. I think one starting point, which is a little bit similar in the Chinese case to the American case, is that Mao and his colleagues believed, as Chinese have often believed, in the centrality of China. To some extent, and here I speak maybe a bit as an Australian-born resident in America, rather than as an American, to some extent it parallels the sense of America's own centrality. Both countries are vast continents. Both countries produce all that they need, in the sense that neither country has to go outside for the basics. They could do without much international trade. Both, if we take the whole span of history, have been remarkably free from outside unwelcome intrusions. And until Marxism, China had borrowed very little from abroad. Buddhism, that's about it. But the Middle Kingdom assumption of the communists is not the same as old China. In many ways it's different. I won't dwell on them now. But what was the same was that he took it for granted that China was important to America. He considered that China was the key to Asia's future. And Mao did adopt for the most part, a come to us kind of attitude to all foreign countries except the Soviet Union. And it's a fact that in his 82 years, he only left China twice, both times to go to Russia. No other country had he ever seen. So the Chinese do think that America should take notice of them. Secondly, the Chinese have a sense of humiliation at what happened from the Opium War for just about a century in their relation with the white man from the West. Here was a civilization immensely accomplished, which the first European travelers to China before the Industrial Revolution recognized to be the richest country in the world. That was Marco Polo's view, for instance, in the 13th century. And yet a country which was brought low in the 19th century because it didn't have the material means to repel traders, consuls, and missionaries who wanted to work their purposes on the ports of the China coast. When the British, who were leading the pack, first arrived, the Chinese emperor said he didn't need what they had to offer. The Emperor Qianlong said to Lord Macartney, the celestial kingdom has no need of the product of outside barbarians, especially since the British brought things like knives and forks and pictures of Jesus and other things that weren't particularly designed for the Chinese culture. But China was not able to resist this intrusion. And the Westerners banged on the door and gained entry and gained control, as many of you will know, of the treaty ports on the China coast. And China lost control of its affairs. And if there's a single key to the outlook of the leaders in Peking today, it's that they value their newfound independence because they have known what it was like to be dependent on foreign control. In 1971, when I visited Zhou Enlai, he spoke to his Australian visitors about the relation between Australia and America. And he said, you Australians should be very careful about your alliance with the United States. He said, we Chinese had an alliance with the Russians, actually signed the treaty the same year as you did, in 1950. And we said that there wasn't much parallel there because the Americans had not treated Australia the way the Russians had treated the Chinese. But Zhou Enlai objected to this, and he said they are both the same, the Russians and the Americans, in that they want to control other people. And socialist China will not be controlled. He got very worked up about this. And I think it's a value that is held from the top to the bottom in China, that China will not be controlled, that the sense of humiliation from that century of Western assault is a most important mental starting point right up till now for China's view of America as for China's view of much of the world. A third starting point for the Chinese is a very different one. The aspiration to modernize. Now, a lot is made of Mao's peasant origins and the austerity and the simplicity of that revolutionary group. Rifles and millet, Mao summed up their way of life during the anti-Japanese war, because they didn't have much else but rifles and millet. But in my view, they have never romanticized backwardness, and they have stated quite frankly, among themselves and in print, that their aim is to make a modern and powerful China. Many things they've done have been rationalizations of backwardness. Brilliant utilization of backwardness in order to create a new kind of power. The Long March itself began in catastrophe and was the activity of a tiny and defeated remnant, but it became the springboard for a resurgence in the war against Japan. Going to Yan'an was not exactly a preferred course of action, and yet it turned out to be the cradle of the social experimentation which is now the norm for policy in the PRC. They turned their weakness into strength, but they are aiming to put weakness behind them entirely. Now, this really means that China, under the communists, has chosen a path of development which is leading it nearer to the levels and to the social experience of the West, including the United States, which is the leading example of an industrial power. And the Chinese that I know are quite steady and realistic in their acceptance of the view that in looking at America, they see some aspects, technical and economic aspects, of the future they hope to have for themselves. So this is a very complicating factor when you put it alongside the sense of humiliation, because it was the West that humiliated China, and yet it is the West that is the advance force of industrial modernization in the world, and China is treading that path. There is undoubtedly a fascination with America on the part of the leading cadre of specialists and the political class in China today. The fourth mental starting point for the Chinese in looking at America is Marxism, which is composed of a class analysis plus a view of how history moves from one stage to the next. The Chinese communists have always believed that imperialism would fall from its internal contradictions. This is one of the laws of history in which they believe. And Mao was very prescient in forecasting the outcome of the Vietnam War. Years ago, before the outcome was at all clear to us, he said they've picked up a stone to throw at the Vietnamese people, but it will drop on their own feet. And through all the zigs and zags of Peking's foreign policy these days, I think it's still steadily true that they do believe that imperialism is doomed, and they do have an underlying optimism that the third world nations will rise, and that the things that are becoming and emerging are really more powerful than the things that are established and that are ruling. The Vietnam War seemed to the Chinese, as to many others, to mark the end of a quarter century in which America was expanding militarily in the Far East. In that period of expansion, China felt threatened by the United States. And indeed, on 3 occasions, the US government did discuss the use of nuclear weapons against the Chinese. Once during the Korean War, and once in the Taiwan Straits crisis, and once over Vietnam. The point of the Nixon-Zhou Enlai understanding was that the Chinese had decided that American expansionism was at an end, that a turning point had been reached, that the US would contract in the future, not expand in East Asia, and that America, having struck trouble in Vietnam, would not give China any trouble in the future. And that's their basic view. And that's why they will do business with the United States and want to have a closer relationship with the United States. Their aim, in other words, in that quarter century since World War II was essentially a negative aim. They wanted the US power to be pushed back from that arc around their doorstep. And really, that's what the Nixon-Kissinger years in US foreign policy did. The reasons for doing it we can leave to one side, but that's what they did. The Chinese appreciated that, and that opened the door to the understanding from 1972 onwards. We can sum up what was the significance of that 1972 breakthrough and Nixon's visit to Peking. It meant that the danger of America-China war was eliminated. In that respect, the 1970s have been totally different from the 1960s. Secondly, the luxury that the Russians enjoyed of seeing their 2 main adversaries out of touch with each other was brought to an end. Thirdly, the international position of the nationalists in Taiwan began to crumble after 1972, and the nationalists have lost the recognition of some 50 or 60 nations since that time. That's not to say that the internal situation has crumbled. I said only the international situation of the nationalists. Fourthly, most of America's allies, headed by Japan, were prompted to effect their own normalization of relations with Peking. And finally, since that Nixon trip, trade, cultural exchanges, and visits by ordinary people have begun again between China and the United States. In a more general way, public opinion here has accepted what might have been accepted earlier. that the conflict of interest between America and China is not great. Apart from the Taiwan problem, these two nations do not have much in the way of conflict of interest. Nothing compared with the conflict of interest that the US has with the Soviet Union, or with that the Chinese have with the Soviet Union, if only by virtue of there being a 4,300-mile border between the two. We have accepted that the world of two blocks, communist and democratic capitalist, has given way to something far more complicated. We should have accepted that before 1972, but at least it has been done now. We've accepted, by and large, that China doesn't have the will or the capacity to indulge in far-flung military conquests. The Chinese are really very preoccupied with the development of their own country. It's true that they have a new interest in the whole world. It is new because never in Chinese history were the Chinese really interested in the whole world, but they have become so. And in that sense, the universalism of Marxism has transformed the Chinese mind. It's very recent that the Chinese have had this sense of the world, but they do have it today, and yet they are not missionary-minded about the world. They are not panting to convert the world to the Chinese way. One should add one more point about that, and I said will or capacity. They don't have the will, but of course they don't really have the capacity yet, and no one can say what the situation will be in 20 or 30 years from now. Certainly the Chinese are doing things that they've never done in their history before, like develop a powerful navy. One of the untold stories of the last few years has been the immense strides that the Chinese Navy has made. Everyone knows that China has a formidable army, but the coming of a navy is a newer thing. So these things became clear in China-American relations after Mr. Nixon's trip.